we've made it to the final panel of the conference. It's been a long 2 days, but a very rich, rewarding few days. Lots of fascinating discussions, so much to reflect on. And I'm delighted to say that we're going out on a high with this wonderful panel organized by Sana and Nathan and Dima, and made even stronger by the addition of Bryony. So welcome, Bryony. And I'm delighted that we're able to end the conference with this wonderful panel. I will introduce people in more detail when we get to each individual speaker, but we have a rich collection of scholars from across the world speaking to us from the region, from the United States, and I don't know where you are right now, Bryony, but a nice geographic spread regardless. And this will allow us to have a really rich and interesting set of reflections on constitutional identities in the region. And from the past 2 days, we've heard about all these different processes of creating inclusion and exclusion and citizenship regimes and the different avenues and legal apparatus that have been deployed by the state. And so I think it's actually really useful to end on this note, to really dive deeply into those documents that will allow us to look at the articulation, performance, resistance of particular identities. So Sana, Nathan, Dima, Bryony, thank you so much. Thank you, Sana, for doing all of this and putting the legwork in to pull everyone together. So thank you. According to the schedule, we have Professor Nathan Brown first. Nathan, I will follow your request and call you Nathan, but if we have 15 minutes per speaker, I'll send you a message when you hit that 15-minute mark and give you a little wave if that's ignored, in the spirit of being polite and respectful. And that goes for everyone. But I'll just quickly introduce Professor Nathan Brown. Many of you will know him, of course. He's a leading scholar in the field. He's Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University, holds a BA in Political Science from Chicago, PhD from Princeton, teaches courses on Middle East politics. He has published extensively on all manner of things pertaining to constitutions, on Egypt, on Palestine. He was a Guggenheim Fellow. He was a Carnegie Scholar. He was a Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, been funded by the USIP, Fulbright Fellowships, serves on the Board of Trustees at the American University in Cairo, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he's done it all, and it's a delight that we have him here today. So, Nathan, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon, for that introduction. Thank you to Sana for organizing this and bringing me into this. And I also should thank, I'm not quite sure if it was Sana or Simon, for putting me first. And the reason I'm happy to go first is because my words are going to be extremely general. I'm looking at the titles of the other papers, and they look to me to be very fascinating specific cases. Mine will be very, very general reflections, and we were speaking before, I think the formal session started, just among ourselves, about the idea of constitutional identity being something that a lot of people want to avoid, because, and we didn't talk about why, but for me the problem is it's just a very, very vague concept, and I'm not quite sure what it means. So I'm going to be trying to give it some specificity, the concept itself, but I'm also going to be talking very, very generally about constitution writing in the Arab world and what it has to do with issues of identity, or an evolving an evolution in that. I'm influenced, for those of you who are familiar with it, by Andrew Arato's post-sovereign constitution making, but I want to push some of what he's developed a little bit farther. But the idea that seeing a constitution writing as as sort of the sovereign act of a sovereign people sort of proclaiming their political will is something that needs to be supplemented, something that we need to push beyond. The term constitutional identity, it's a new term, and I think there's a reason for that. Seeing a constitution as somehow connected with questions of identity, the identity of a political community, that's an old idea. But it's also an abstract one, and one that has sort of informed philosophical discussions about what constitution writing is about, what constitutions are about, what constitutionalism is. But it has broken through to the world of short-term politics only in very specific political circumstances, general crises. But that seems to be different now. Now, when there are constitutional discussions carried out at a political level, at a public level, issues of identity often come in very, very quickly. There's increasing public involvement, engagement in constitutional issues. When constitutions are written, there's often an awful lot more public discussion than there has been in the past, and a lot of that discussion focuses on the identity, what I would call the identity or the identitarian provisions of constitutions. The parts that, if you're a constitutional law professor, you probably kind of read quickly by. Oh, there's, some sort of clearing of the throat and maybe 5 or 10 clauses, and they seem to get longer and longer about this is where the state is, or progressively longer preambles. But ones that, although their legal content isn't quite clear, they really do talk about issues of political community and political identity, and an awful lot of political debate focuses on provisions that sometimes don't necessarily have clear legal meaning. In a sense, what I think has happened, and I'm talking about a vague but general, a global trend, is that people, individuals and groups, seem to look to see if the Constitution speaks for them now and for their future. And when they read a Constitution, say, what does this express who I am or who we are? I want to trace the issue of constitutional identity in the Arab world over the past century and a half by switching the subject slightly. I want to not talk directly about identity, although that will come into it, but talk instead about constitutional voice. And I mean that in a very literal way, right? So a constitution, when it's written, is written often in the first person. The we, or I, so who is the we or the I who are writing this? That is, who is presenting themselves as the author of the Constitution? Who is constituting something, or who or what is being constituted? And I think there's an interesting evolution here in terms of the apparent author of the text, but also in terms of the real author of the text. And let me go back here, and I'll try to sort of review this history fairly quickly. If you look at early constitutional documents, I would say not just in the Arab world, but in the Middle East as a whole, and this is actually a global trend, they tended to be written in the first person in the name of the ruler. So the first person, we the king, we the emperor, we the this or the that. Interestingly, the first constitution in the Arab world was called the law of the Tunisian Dawla. And Dawla, of course, in modern Arabic means state. At the time, the term was, as I understand it, making a transition from essentially meaning kind of ruling house to meaning state apparatus. And if you read that document, what you see is, yes, the people whom the Tunisian ruling house rules are in that document, but they're referred to as the flock. There's a very paternalistic view. This is not the Tunisian people constituting themselves and speaking. This is the Tunisian ruling house speaking in the first person. Who's really authoring this document? Well, early constitutional documents tended to be written by senior state officials, and they were very often worried about governance issues, and in a sense tried to persuade the ruler or impose upon the ruler the idea that the state had to be run in accordance with clear principles, especially on fiscal and legal issues, sometimes having to do with treatments of individual citizens and so on. And so the constitutional voice is that of the ruler. The constitutional author is essentially an emerging state apparatus, the leaders of an emerging state apparatus. And there I'm talking about the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. Constitutions, there still are existing constitutions that are written in the first person in the name of the ruler. The Jordanian constitution is written in the name of King Talal, who was the king when it was issued. But it's far more common for them to be issued in the name of the people. And so the people present themselves as the author of the constitutional text. Who's really writing them? Well, it's existing regimes for the most part. So in essence, most constitutional documents, certainly before 2011, were written by existing regimes, not constituting those regimes, but an existing regime deciding how it wanted to steer the state apparatus, but also how it wanted to present itself as the voice of the people in so doing. And so, in a sense, those are constitutions that I sometimes call ventriloquist constitutions, in the sense that the people are speaking, or the people are being made to speak, but it's rulers or regimes that are actually doing the speaking. In that process, the identitarian provisions of constitutions began to get longer, because these were constitutions that were now presenting themselves as expressions of, as constituting a political entity. Sometimes for the first time, this was going to be a sovereign political entity entering the world stage, applying for membership in the League of Nations or the United Nations. But so this was a people who were defining themselves ostensibly, but as I say, it was an act of ventriloquism. In the last 10 years, it depends on where, sometimes a little bit longer in other places, and shorter in others. You've seen a shift, most memorably, and I'll focus my remarks here on Egypt, with the slogan that was used not only in Egypt but in other places: the people want the form of the people want to follow the regime, or the people want this, the people want that. And there was a moment in 2011 when in many Arab societies it seemed like there was a people, a single people. My own sense is that there were lots of people, more than ever before, but seeing or claiming that there was an entity of the people is one that aggravated the political difficulties that followed the uprisings of 2011. So in a sense, when you use the term the people, you're engaging in, first, an act of political exclusion, right? So these are the people, and the people who are not included in the people, or people who are not included, people are not part of the political community. But second, it is, again, this is an act of ventriloquism. Some persons are claiming to speak for the people. The people, as a phrase, insist, using that as a phrase, insist that there is a single unity, rather than that is speaking in a single voice, rather than people coming together to build or rebuild something. It is the people who are constituting something. And now I've spoken now on a very general level. As I say, most of the presentations here have been specific, very, very specific. But here I actually find myself picking up on the last paper of the previous panel with Murray Phillips, when she was in some of her final comments. And what I'm going to apply to Egypt since 2011. I mean, Egyptian society is diverse, and so there's all kinds of religious, political, class, social, ethnic, economic, geographic differences. And what is particularly difficult and sometimes not noted about the Egyptian case is that I was just talking about the way Egyptian society is diverse, but the Egyptian state itself contains many entities that have their own powerful vision of how society and politics should operate. Whether it's Al-Azhar, or whether it's the security apparatus, whether it's the military, whether it's the judiciary, and so on, there are very powerful state institutions that, in a sense, all claim to be able to speak for the people, that have a very, very strong sense that the burden is on them. If you listen to certainly the current Egyptian president's rhetoric, if you listen to sometimes senior religious officials in Al-Azhar, you will sort of hear them talking almost in terms of that to me are a little bit resonant of the law of the Tunisian dynasty back in the 19th century, a paternalistic sense in which we are, there is an Egyptian people and we speak for them and we protect them. We are the ones who necessarily give them a moral and religious voice. If you're Al-Azhar, we protect the people and provide for them if you're the president and so on. And the problem that Egyptians experienced then after 2011 was that those divisions about who spoke for the people were denied, or their legitimacy was denied by key actors who saw their opponents not simply as wrong, they were a third hand, they were sheep. There was literally dehumanizing term used in Egypt by most political actors. As I say, literally dehumanizing those who are not with, you're either with the people or you are not even fully human. But as I say, it's not simply various political forces, the Brotherhood, revolutionaries, and so on, that were claiming to be speaking for the people. Leaders of important state institutions were doing the same, claiming to be the true guardian of the Egyptian people. And in the sense, rejecting any mechanisms of constitutional accountability, since they were, in a sense, saw themselves as above or prior to the constitutional order. So in a sense, those state actors not only portrayed themselves as paternalistic defenders or trustees of the interests and the values and the security of the people, but is best able to perform their task if they were freed up to follow the dictates of their own conscience and expertise, rather than being accountable through constitutional mechanism. So the real challenge for constitution making in that context, if you abolish the people and deal only with real people, is that it's difficult to, there are several difficulties. First, how do you decide which actors are going to be heard? The Egyptian constitutional process after 2011, I think, was one which ostensibly was one of the people constituting themselves, but in effect was essentially of specific state bodies reconstituting a regime. In the first attempt that was seen when the in the Brotherhood dominated process, it was essentially an act of bargaining between the Brotherhood and specific state actors, a bargain that didn't take hold. And after that point, after the overthrow of the Brotherhood in 2013, it was essentially key state actors coming together, dominated by the military, but also with the participation of the security apparatus and other state bodies. So how constitutional theory, and talk about constitutional identity, does it, when it pretends that the process is there to constitute the state, doesn't really know what to do with a state that is trying to constitute itself. And so the stress on constitutional identity or of constitutional authorship as if it is the people, in a sense, obscures that fact. Even Andrew Arato's constitutional identity, post-sovereign constitution making, which I made reference to at the outset, and I'm wrapping up here, for those of you who are familiar with it, talks about inclusivity, but doesn't really know what to do with state actors. And that's where the Egyptian process began to fall down. So constitution making seen that way, not as an act of the people, but as a place, constitutions and constitution writing and constitutional documents as a place where real people actually come in and begin to find ways to manage their differences with each other, are difficult. Because it's hard to figure out who gets a seat at the table. And when you are inclusive, it's hard to find an agreement that will unify them and where they can manage their differences. But seeing constitutions as a way in which the people speak as a single voice is, I think, poisonous and undermines or obscures the reality of the hard politics involved in constitution making in ways that I think has undermined the process in the Arab world over the last decade.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And that was pretty much bang on 15 minutes. It's almost as if you've done this type of thing before, Nathan. Next on our list is Dr. Sana Sagali, co-founder and director of the Constitutional Studies Center in Nablus, Palestine. She's the 9th member of the Palestinian Drafting Committee appointed by the Palestinian Liberation Organization's legislative arm, the Palestinian National Council, in 2019. She is the new holder of the UNESCO Chair on Human Rights, Democracy and Peace at An-Najah University. She's the first female obtaining a PhD in constitutional law in Palestine, which she received from Lancaster University, and an LLM in law from Durham. She focuses on semi-presidential systems, application in Palestine, and the constitution-making process. She's a fellow with CEPAD and at the Richardson Institute. Her work with CEPAD is focused on sectarian issues and constitutional identity in the Middle East. She is the elected chairwoman of the board of directors of Women, Media and Development. And if I carry on much further, Sana, I'll be using into your 15 minutes.
Exactly.
It's the longest bio I think I've ever seen.
No, because it's the bio you have. I don't know.
It's a very long bio, but that's a testament to all the wonderful stuff you're doing.
No,
So,
thank you. No, it would have been.
We now have 13 minutes. Over to you.
No, I mean, first of all, thank you so much. Hello to everyone. And I would say thanks to all CEPAD team, actually, for wonderful 2 days of sessions, and for Professor Simon Maben for creating this constitutional panel in this conference that hopefully will be the start for roundtable discussions next term and publication with CEPAD. And again, thanks for Professor Brown, Bryony, and Dima for joining this panel. We were talking about how constitutional identity is quite vague. And I think I was very ambitious when I connected the constitutional identity with the May uprising in Palestine. So my presentation today is about loss and hope post the May uprising in Palestine. So today's presentation asks the question of whether the basic law or the constitutional arrangements in Palestine captured a clear constitutional identity that helped creating a shared identity instead of enabling a divided one. Unfortunately, the basic law failed in capturing or creating a constitutional identity that speaks to the Palestinians that this document was supposed or intended to govern. Therefore, I will try to show how May uprising can be a roadmap for the constitutional drafters to build on and try to use it for creating a proper constitutional identity in any future constitutional drafting in Palestine. Before I talk about the May uprising, I would like to highlight, and I think Professor Brown mentioned the constitutional identity, the definition of the term, but what does really constitutional identity mean to me and how it's connected to May uprising? Arguably, constitutional identity is crucial as it enables a shared feeling of belonging among the citizenship and between the state and society. Without the shared collective element behind a constitution, it becomes disconnected and perhaps irrelevant to its context. In this way, I will borrow from Professor Brown's notion of paper constitutions and say, if constitutional drafters are to recognize the importance of this constitutional identity, then they must consider the bigger project while they are putting this constitution and be more than bureaucratic technocrats and acknowledge their role in this process. In the drafting process, then, the constitution makers must consider the people as they are. They should look at the society, what they aim to the society to be in the future while they draft the future constitution, but at the same time, consider the society now and what the society would be like without erasing the proper identity or the identity of the society, and put possibilities and scenarios about what this constitution will create. Therefore, the constitutional identity is not only the feeling of belonging, it's about the political system that they will choose. It's about the way we, the people, or the voices, as Professor Brown mentions, in the Constitution will be reflected. May uprising showed that the basic law and the way it enabled the division between the Palestinians and the political sectarianism that it started in 2007 is no longer needed, is no longer what the society looks like, or at least what the youth want the society to look like. Therefore, May uprising showed a sense of solidarity between Palestinians, indicating that when conditions are ripe, it can and should translate into constitutional arrangements that will affirm the political reality that is a state of Palestine at some point. This sense of solidarity got lost after the death of Yasser Arafat, because since 2007, West Bank and Gaza has been divided between political sectarianism, as I mentioned, Hamas and Fatah. And therefore, on the 18th of May 2021, Palestinians, regardless of this political sectarianism, regardless of being Hamas or Fatah, regardless of also the status that was given to them by Israel, I mean the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and inside Israel, or often referred to as 1948 Palestinians, stood shoulder to shoulder in a national strike to demonstrate the refusal to live under Israeli occupation and its 73-year project of annexation and apartheid. This youthful voice has replaced the voices of tired leaders and given life to what has seemed to be a decaying liberation movement. Therefore, before this uprising, the basic law and the constitutional identity it brought after 2002, it could have only been described as divide and conquer. Because since the accords of the mid-90s and the international agreement that set the framework for future policies in the region, Palestinians have been subjected to a process of geopolitical division. This division was officially, as I mentioned, formulated by the basic law, the temporary constitution, that lacked a proper political system. The political system was supposed to be a parliamentary, then it had features of a presidential system. And because of this weak essence of what the basic law would govern and what it aimed to govern, after the second intifada, the whole political system was changed in the roadmap agreement, creating a position of a prime minister, causing domestically political instability. These factors, in combination with the 2006 elections, which saw West Bank and Gaza split, as I mentioned, has automized the Palestinian unification and meant that there must be, it meant that Palestinians are also not divided between Hamas and Fatah. They are also divided between idealists, pragmatists, in the face of the ongoing Israeli aggression of expansion. Then after May uprising, this idea of we the people, or the idea of the Palestinians that the basic law came up with in 1997 when it was drafted, because the basic law meant that it will only govern, or we the people means in it people in the West Bank and people in Gaza. So we the people, or the notion of we the people, after May uprising from a constitutional point of view, meant an opportunity to reclaim it in a proper way. In the past, political elites claimed to speak for the people while actually excluding them from government. And that's what we saw in 2007. And this has not been benefiting Palestinians, because Israel has been picking up the pieces, sometimes literally left behind by those losers in these political conflicts. The Palestinian elections that has been postponed showed that the status quo, or staying or keeping the situation as it is not something that Palestinians would want to have. However, we the people meant, after postponing the elections, regardless of the reasons, the restrictions on ballots in East Jerusalem by Israel, etc., meant that we the people, regardless of the uprising, is still stuck with the political elite. And the new uprising also showed that the new generation and the Palestinian identity that was lost, or let's say got divided in 2007, keeps growing in a different way, keeps growing in the face of Israeli aggression, as this feeling of loss, feeling of hopelessness became a crucial aspect of it. So the question now, how can we overcome this kind of loss and build hope for the future Palestinian state? The question then, well, many people answer this and say, let's start and draft a new constitution. But there are major questions to be asked before we draft a constitution. If we go for elections with the current state, then the elections will be built according to the basic law, which enabled a huge division between the Palestinian lines. Therefore, going for elections is not a solution. Going quickly for drafting a constitution, that means that the political elites will take the lead. Therefore, or saying, oh, let's go for a reconciliation and having the constitution to be a crucial element in this reconciliation is a good idea, but it means that only the two political parties will be the one in charge of drafting this new constitution. That means any constitutional identity that this new constitution would reflect, it won't reflect what really the people or we the people want. And a clear example of that is the draft of 2016 that did not involve any kind of public participation. It was limited to political elite. It was limited to one or two political parties involved in the process. Therefore, the best solution, and this is also a suggestion, is to go for a constitutional building process. The constitutional building process might be able to answer major questions. First of all, what kind of state do Palestinians want to build? This should not be limited to political elites to answer it. Secondly, who is a Palestinian and how could the Palestinian state integrate all its potential citizens? This is a crucial question that needs more involvement. What kind of constitutional control is suitable to protect the principles of separation of powers, the rule of law, and constitutional rights in Palestine? These questions can only be resolved in relation to a constitutional building process in line with the reconciliation process. Another major question, the future constitution, and I think Professor Brown mentioned what kind of the constitution would constitute what. And in the case of Palestine, the new constitution would constitute what? The Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the Palestinian Authority, or the State of Palestine. And in order to be able to answer all these kinds of questions, we need grassroots movements, we need public participation, transparency. And if this kind of elements exist, then we can say that there is a hope to create a constitutional identity that make people feel this kind of belonging towards a constitution that can reflect what they really want. I will stop to here. I think, did I finish my 15 minutes, Simon?
You have 3 minutes left.
I think I will reserve them for the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's entirely fair. Maybe this is your subconscious apologizing for the length of your bio.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sana. Really interesting stuff, as always. I always learn a great deal from listening to you, you speak about these things. Next up, all the way from Beirut, hopefully, is Dima Smaira. Dima is a lecturer at the Political Studies and Public Administration Department at AUB, the American University of Beirut, and an independent researcher. She is interested in the spatial and everyday turns in international relations and uses traditional, qualitative, and participatory visual ethnographic methods in pursuit of this. Her research is looking into youth and citizenship in deeply divided societies and on everyday peace and security, in particular in Lebanon. She's done some really amazing stuff on space in Dahia, and delighted that we're going to be in a special issue together at some point in the not too distant future, I believe. Hopefully. We're also welcoming Dima to the SEPAD community after Christmas, which is very exciting. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your presentation, Dima. So your 15 minutes start now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to finally participate in one of CEPAD's events. What I have for you today is kind of new, relatively new, and quite tentative. So I haven't worked with constitutional identity before, but I'm trying to bridge it a little bit with some of the work that I've done previously. So as you can see over here, I'm trying to think about constitutional frameworks, citizenship education, and lived experiences of youth in Lebanon. Oh, let me properly go to slideshow, if that works. Yes. All right. So as some of you might know, citizenship is often invoked in divided societies like Lebanon in order to promote a more peaceful coexistence. And in the past few years, they've witnessed a big emphasis on citizenship education, especially by the donor community, as a way to overcome division, supposedly, and to foster a common national identity in Lebanon. And citizenship education largely deals with the constitutional framework and the constitutional identity of Lebanon. And to add, from the perspective of donor community, there's often an extra flavor of cosmopolitanism added over there as well. So I'm using material from work that I conducted between 2004 and 2016 with young people living in different parts of Lebanon as part of a previous project exploring youth citizenship in societies with a history of conflict and division. And I'm using as well more recent discussions that I've had with some young people at AUB. And all of this to try to make sense of how youth experience constitutional identity and citizenship in Lebanon, and try to think about a process for a more effective role for constitutional identity over here. Now, some of you as well might know Lebanon's constitutional framework is mainly composed of the 1926 Constitution, the Verbal National Pact, and the Taif Agreement of 1989. All of them together, they set the legal relationship, of course, between state and citizens, constitutional identity of Lebanon, positioning it in the region and in the world at large. Now, the framework positions Lebanon quite ambiguously, though, between the West and the Arab world, first starting off with having an Arab face. So we were cautious back then, and then more affirming of giving Lebanon, or noting that Lebanon would be an Arab state, so more assertive position over here. But now there's a bit more complexity in the position of Lebanon, particularly in the region. Are we part of a resistance axis, so to speak, the MENA? Or are we part or linked to the Gulf hinterland? Can it be both? Certainly the verdict is not yet out. This is playing out as we speak, of course. Now, as well, reflecting the heterogeneity of society in Lebanon, the framework sets the system as a power-sharing system between its confessional groups. As a republic, it is founded, of course, on the separation of branches of power. And as a founding member of the United Nations, the Constitution commits to among other things, of course, to the UNDHR, and as party to most human rights treaties, international obligations take precedence. The Constitution says then, therefore, the constitutional framework says, therefore, that Lebanon is founded on the principles of equality amongst its citizenship, founded on individual freedom, liberties, amongst other things. But as we also know, of course, the system in Lebanon is very closely tied to political sectarianism, starting off with what we call muhassasa, or the distribution of posts in government. First, starting off being based on a 6:5 ratio in favor of Christians. Then we moved on to parity. This muhassasa was meant to be for higher posts in government, the highest of posts in governments, whereas the rest of the administration was, the posts there were supposed to be distributed in accordance to the grand national interest and national harmony as well. Meaning of this, if you're appointed by your sect leader, are we talking about a partisan state? Another question that is currently complicating things as well in terms of this muhassasa. Should we move to what we refer to nowadays as muthalatha? This is the rule by third, so distributing posts along Christian, Sunni, and Shia proportions. Another issue to highlight in order not to mess up, this rigid sectarian balance that we have, the scarecrow that's often given to us. Women, in contrast to what the Constitution says, do not have the right to pass on their nationality to their children or to the spouses. This is to guard against the threat of nationalizing Palestinian refugees and others in particular. But then also what does this do is that it keeps the spouses and the children of Lebanese women outside the boundaries of citizenship, of course. A third issue that I want to note as well in this framework, the contrast with the framework, is the issue of Maktoumi al-Qaid, or individuals that have their registry or that have close status. These are non-registered individuals at the time of the only census ever taken in Lebanon in 1932, they remain so unregistered, and they remain outside the boundaries of citizenship too. A fourth also issue that I'd like to highlight is how the autonomy given to confessional groups in personal status matters, and by that not having a civil code, a common civil code on personal status matters, has meant that custody rights, for example, are dependent on religious codes, which are highly unfavorable to women across the board, across the various codes, across the sects. So I would certainly go on to say that the framework that we have is certainly somewhat flawed, a flawed constitutional system with certainly a problematic constitutional identity as well. What we can argue is that this framework is certainly vague. It's even contradictory, and one of my students even told me that it's somewhat schizophrenic. The system, the framework, is also rigid rather than dynamic. It's unable unable and resisting to moving with the times. While political sectarianism was conceived as a temporary phase in the constitutional framework, it has become more and more entrenched and has been deepening sectarian divisions, primarily because that framework is not clear enough, because that framework is not authoritative enough, and primarily as well because its implementation depends on sectarian elite or sponsors. So this rigidity is then trapping Lebanon in a flawed sectarianized system, unable to effectively regulate life and foster a common national identity, unable to foster reconciliation, integration, or social cohesion. When asked about citizenship education, which covers supposedly Lebanon's constitutional identity, high school students we spoke with in public schools from across Lebanon have noted things like you get a sense that the textbook is dealing with an ideal watan, and we know that that's not the case. And the civics education teachers explained that it's the contradiction between the constitutional or legal framework taught in citizenship education and reality that young people experience is quite stark. Issues such as Arab brotherly relations, the role of the United Nations, peacekeeping and peace building, and locally, of course, democratic processes, participation, meritocracy, rule of law, accountability, all integral parts to Lebanon's constitutional framework and constitutional identity, do not resonate with the context young people or even older people living in Lebanon experience. Instead, what they see is a state that does not provide services. They see sectarian-based clientelism, corruption, paralysis, extension of parliamentary terms, presidential vacuums, all because of political sectarian competition. They are also seeing an increasingly police state. They are seeing increased antagonism between confessional groups. They see us caught in a struggle of power, in a regional struggle of power, and they see the international community closing down on Lebanon. At AUB, where of course then we're talking about with older youth. Students seem to be want to address or talk about harassment of activists, police brutality, military tribunals prosecuting civilians, curtailment of freedom of speech, right of refugees, domestic violence, marital rape, and effective participation of women. Things that seem quite remote or maybe too progressive or too advanced for the unidimensional focus on sectarianism. They also want to see, of course, accountability, including of ministers, separation of branches of government, particularly as well, they want to see independence of the judiciary in light of the interventions, political intervention that has been ongoing in the work of the special investigator assigned to look into the August 2020 Beirut blast. So with that, we find that juxtaposing constitutional frameworks to structural and everyday realities for the expressions that youth gave us, that they experience hesitation, confusion, loss, frustration, disillusionment, anger, hurt, anxiety, sense of failure, and despair towards the current constitutional identity of Lebanon. They fail to see it around them, and they fail to contribute to change or good citizenship towards that identity that they learn about. So this negotiation between the ideals they see in the constitutional frameworks and that they aspire for and the realities that they live in has been quite troubling to many. And what I'm trying to do is try to recognize the effective aspect of reconciling the constitutional frameworks and citizenship pedagogy with a practice or lived dimension of constitutional identity. And to note as well that constitutional identity and citizenship are situated, subjective, intimate, even or especially as they come into play with the social, legal, and structural world. And without necessarily refuting that an improved constitutional identity, if we ever achieve that, and an improved citizen pedagogy would enable good citizenship. I argue that the link is quite a complex one. And I emphasize that the weight that the structural realities place on the agency of youth in navigating between the ideals, all right, of common national identity and constitutional identity and everyday practice is quite heavy, in showing how troubling this is to balance between the everyday citizenship and those constitutional ideals. We can also see the uncertainty in enacting good citizenship or constitutional identity. And indeed, we've seen that there are no indications that youth are able to take these ideals of constitutional identity too far beyond the personal dilemma. They may sometimes reconsider the boundaries of citizenship and may even reimagine a more inclusive good society. But enacting them actually may set them at odds with their worlds, and they may or may not be able to find a space to pursue or enact these notions. And instead, they often find themselves really having to conform to and be complicit in structural injustices, having to accept sectarianism, corruption, abuse of law, rely on patronage as well, and enact themselves sectarian identity politics, practices which are quite inconsistent with the good citizenship established in our constitutional framework. So simply for getting by, wanting to reach what would be considered a good life, maybe in Lebanon, one usually needs to abide by the formal or informal norms of Lebanon's clientelistic sectarian system. So everyday citizenship, where are we? Everyday citizenship often consists of resorting to traditional power relations entrenched in the status quo. And as you see in the quote over here, what happened, as one of the teachers explained to us, what happens when those young people graduate and they need a service, particularly find a spot at university as basic as that, or even find a job. Well, at the end of the day, they're going to receive it from the sectarian party rather than the state. And moving or building on that, in a manifestation of what Payne and Staley referred to as intimacy geopolitics, views and acts of citizenship should be seen as inextricably linked and shaped by our environment. And indeed, conceptions and conditions of citizenship emanate from a temporal and spatial, socioeconomic, and political context. This weighs heavy on people, of course, but in talking about this affective aspect, I'd like to advance intimacy geopolitics to be part of our reading of constitutional identity, and step away from the traditional dichotomy or the separation and the hierarchy between the geopolitical and the intimate, recognizing that the intimate is shaped by geopolitical development, but also that geopolitics is shaped by the intimate. They're both entangled and shape each other. So intimacy geopolitics, I see it as confounding scales and showing the inseparability of politics from emotional geographies. Simon, can you let me know what time? Okay.
I just sent you a message.
Yes, okay.
And here's the little wave to say almost.
All right. All right. So then, as long as constitutional identity and constitution making do not speak to and address our problematic past, do not speak to the reality people live in, cannot effectively order life, cannot effectively bring together imaginaries of peoples and groups, then we remain on what Professor Brown often refers to as paper constitutions. And we remain caught in a space in between, whereby people are bouncing or straddling between ideals found in constitutions and the realities they live in, falling short from constitutional identity, taking hold and effectively shaping life. Now, of course, many talk about a transitional phase, an interim phase, an interim constitution, whereby often we need to realistically recognize that that the sectarian elite or representative may need to be present, but also one that suggests a wide and effective participation, but also with realistically, I would say as well, recognizing the broad structures that shape us, whether they're geopolitical, institutional, legal, relational, or social. Since I'm out of time, I'm going to stop there. I've got a bit more to say, but I'll stop here.
I'm sure there's a lot more to say on this topic, Dima, but hopefully we'll get a chance in the Q&A to pick up on these things.
Sure.
So many questions that I've got for you that I could easily dominate that, but I won't. But I might be in touch with a few thoughts via email later. But we must move swiftly on to our final speaker of the conference, and I'm delighted that we are welcoming here, possibly with child or no child.
No child, although you might hear sounds coming up.
Amazing. Well, I hope we do. That would be a wonderful way of ending this. I'm delighted that we have Bryony Jones here. Bryony is a reader in international development in the Politics and International Studies Department of the University of Warwick. She's also the co-director of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development and associate researcher at both Swiss Peace and the Geneva Centre of Humanitarian Studies. Delighted that Bryony's here. There's a lot to reflect on from a different disciplinary perspective, I guess, asking similar types of questions. So I'm keen to hear these different types of answers. Thank you, Bryony. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the very warm welcome to your panel as well. I really appreciate it. It's my first experience at SEPAC conference and it's going very well. So maybe just a little bit of context for the work I'm going to present, because it's actually part of a larger book project. So the book itself is called The Transitional Justice Citizen, from Justice Receiver to Justice Seeker. And it's focused on trying to develop a new concept, or a concept of citizenship at times of transition, where you have justice interventions following large-scale violations of human rights, either as part of a war or an authoritarian regime. And the book is split into two parts. So the first part looks at how this citizen is kind of imagined and framed through transitional justice policy and practice. And then the second part is looking at how those citizens are not just framed, but are enacting themselves all the time and are making and contesting justice claims. And so I have 3 empirical chapters. So the first part looks at duties, rights and virtues, and then the second part takes empirical case studies that look at how those duties, rights and virtues are being expanded and contested by people in place, in time and in action. And the 3 empirical chapters are Bosnia-Herzegovina, Côte d'Ivoire and Tunisia. And so I'm presenting today the work on Tunisia, which is really focused on, in more detail, on Black Tunisian activism post 2011 and how Black Tunisian activists mobilized to try and expand the kind of justice claims, the justice that was on offer to them as part of the transitional justice process. So although Tunisia, as I'm sure you're all aware, is seen in many ways kind of positively, and certainly in the transitional justice field where I come from, it's seen as quite a positive case study in the sense that justice initiatives, fairly comprehensive justice initiatives, were implemented quite soon after the fall of Ben Ali's regime, and Tunisia is kind of seen as being able to kind of keep hold of the stability and democratic progress, much more so than other kind of Arab Spring countries. But of course, that doesn't tell the whole story, as we'll see from the work of the Black Tunisian activists. So to say something a little bit about the kind of the history of racism and Black Tunisians, just to kind of give some of that historical context. So it's very much debated, the kind of, in a sense, the origin story of the Black Tunisian population. But in the kind of national imagination, Black Tunisians are often associated with a history of the slave trade in Tunisia and the region, and also with positions of servitude. And this has had an effect on concrete practices. So, for example, Black Tunisians are often issued with birth certificates that have the words for slave or freed person attached to the name, for example, and there are practices of segregated school buses or cemeteries in the south of the country. It's important to say that Black Tunisians are not a homogenous group, unsurprisingly, and lots of anthropologists have written about how it's actually quite hard to identify a specific Black identity or culture, and there's a lot of diversity in political opinion. In terms of the kind of history of racism and discrimination against Black Tunisians, there's a post-colonial denial of Black Tunisian identity as part of kind of a project of modernization and unity, essentially. And this was really continued under Ben Ali's regime, where racism was really denied, as well as a Black identity. And it was very difficult for Black activists or anti-racist activists to set up associations and to work, essentially. And this kind of silencing has led to and denied lots of different forms of discrimination that Black Tunisians have experienced historically and also continue to experience today. And so the activists that I interviewed and spoke to really pointed towards a lack of kind of public profile of Black Tunisians. You don't see many Black Tunisians in positions of political power, authority, or in the media, for example, or as public intellectuals. And there are lots of daily kind of assaults, both verbal and physical, that are documented by Black Tunisians, although they're significantly underreported. And so what was interesting was that the transitional justice moment really gave an opportunity for Black Tunisians to build on a history of anti-racist struggle, which had been really suppressed and invisibilized, to really build on that and to start making claims as full citizens and to start trying to get acknowledgement of the injustices that they'd suffered. And so the moment of transitional justice, I write about in the chapter, it really is, the significance of it for Black activists was much more to do with the democratic shift and the opening up of civil society and political space, much more than it was the content of the justice that was on offer. Because in fact, racism and the situation of Black Tunisians was not really a focus of the transitional justice process. So as I mentioned earlier, it was seen as being quite a comprehensive, holistic process. So you had a national dialogue, you had a transitional justice law, had a dignity commission, Truth and Dignity Commission, special chambers in the courts of Tunisia, and a reparations fund. And the transitional justice law, which was passed, makes reference to special categories of people, doesn't refer to Black Tunisians, and it also doesn't refer to racial discrimination as part of the historical injustices that are going to be addressed in the transitional justice process. There was, however, in the final report of the Truth Commission, which completed its work and submitted its report, it was officially published in 2020, there was a small section on racial discrimination in that final report, and I won't quote the whole section. It's quite small, but still too lengthy here. And it writes, refers to the need to focus on citizenship questions and values of tolerance, regardless of colour, sex, ethnicity, and religious affiliation. That the Commission has not found complaints and lawsuits filed by racial discrimination victims, but this is largely indicative of the lack of appropriate legislation or the ignorance of existing legal remedies or distrust of the authorities in taking effective judicial action. They recommend that racial discrimination is criminalised, and that the phenomenon of racial discrimination and violence against the different other, especially those of Black or brown skin, is still rooted in the Tunisian popular imagination and in the daily discourse. And what's important about this is, of course, it's an acknowledgement that it's a citizenship question. It's about full and equal citizenship, and also that Black Tunisians have been marginalised and disempowered socially, economically, and culturally. So this was really important, but of course, it doesn't necessarily go far enough. So in terms of thinking about Black Tunisians and their kind of what I refer to in the book as acts of citizenship, but their kind of activism in order to realise and make claims and articulate themselves as full and equal Tunisian citizens, what was really interesting is that this democratic shift that I mentioned, the opening up of political and associational space, really brought to the forefront this reality of the diversity of the Tunisian population that had previously been kind of denied. And that it's not just historical diversity, but a very real diversity. And this included, of course, the Black Tunisian collective mobilisation. And their mobilisation initially focused on the new constitution that was being written. And they really pushed to have a particular definition of equal citizenship. And from that point, then grew their activism and started to make wider justice claims, particularly focusing on the legal battle for the recognition of the existence of racism and also for specific legal reforms. So a key association in the movement called NEMTI, they submitted a dossier to the Truth Commission, which partly led to the recognition of the racism as an issue in the final report, where they requested the memorialization of historical sites related to slavery, also regulations to allow individuals to change their names, to remove this free slave or freed person salutation, as it were, and an end to different forms of segregation that are seen. But there was a sense of kind of frustration as this was happening, that the new constitution, when it was written, in Article 21, declaring the equal status of all citizens, didn't go far enough. And so the activists thought that the definition of equality of citizenship was too vague and didn't, in their view, go far enough towards specifically outlawing racism, or indeed offering a legal basis for Black Tunisians to defend themselves against racism. So what happened is that they then went to the next stage and started working with the only Black MP, Tunisian Black MP, and with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to develop an anti-racism law. And this law was passed on the 9th of October 2018 and is the first of its kind in North Africa and the Arab world, and has been used to really great effect by lawyers and activists. So on the 14th of October in 2020, you had the landmark case of a father and son who were legally entitled to remove slave from their names and from their birth certificates. And that paves the way for future such cases, although that's complicated because it requires a certain level of resources, a certain level of legal training amongst the judges, and also a certain bravery on the part of people that come forward, because it isn't necessarily socially or culturally easy to go through that legal process. And so there's a kind of a sense in the interviews that I did and also the writings about Tunisia that the Black activists really managed to bring to the fore a recognition of racism, but of course discrimination still continues, and implementing the provisions in the constitution and also the new law is very, very difficult. And Yamina Taba, who's the president of the Tunisian Association for the Support of Minorities, was quoted in 2018 as saying, "In recent years, we've mainly fought against denial to make the authorities recognize that racism does exist in Tunisia. Now the real fight for rights begins." And so the kind of concluding sort of argument, I suppose, that I make in the chapter is that what's important about the activism of the Black Tunisians, which are not, there isn't a lot of work writing about what they do, in fact. When I interviewed particularly representatives of international organizations who supported the justice process in Tunisia, they'd say, "Oh, what do you mean by Black Tunisian activists? I've never heard of this. I don't know about the dossier they submitted, like what's going on?" But what they managed to do was really bring to the fore historical injustice and kind of connect it, those historical injustices, to connect it to the contemporary process of trying to seek justice for a specific period of time related to a specific set of violations under a particular authoritarian regime. So they took the transitional justice moment and they said, that's great, but we need to push back on that. We need to expand the kind of justice that's on offer to us. And we need to see this as a continual process in trying to actualize ourselves as citizens and to live as equal citizens in Tunisia. And so in terms of the kind of larger argument of the book, I use this to say that although often transitional justice processes assume that the beneficiary population will accept the justice and will be content to play their role in supporting the justice process, actually what often happens is that justice is very contested and is not coming into a vacuum, but is coming into a context of historical and long-term struggle over the boundaries and meaning of the political community, and that needs to be taken into account. So I think I've used up my time and I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bryony. That's really, really fascinating. And that final question that you pose, I imagine, is one of the central themes of the book, as to how do you interrogate that idea of of belonging, of justice, and the interplay between what is normatively accepted to be right and what people actually want, and how that all fits into the context of a state, the political, and those lines of inclusion and exclusion within the body politique, I guess. But at least that's what I'm thinking of right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Amazing. So we have some time for discussions, and we have a dedicated group of people who've made it to the bitter end, which is, as Ruba said on Twitter, it's a really good way of ending this conference. And if I may, I'll quote her, because I think she's put it really neatly. Makes great sense to end the conference with a panel on constitutionalism, citizenship, identity, because where else does a state begin in legitimizing or criminalizing identities? And I think that's a really good way of putting it. So you can pose questions in the Q&A. Ideally put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat box, just for ease of purpose. We have a question from Mohammed, who presented yesterday, I think. It's been a long couple of days. Bryony, can you see the question?
I can, yes, I'm just reading it. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect.
Am I being silly? Right at the end, for bus segregation cemeteries, please look for TGE context. Am I being silly by not understanding what that means? Sorry, just so I can answer the question.
I don't know.
Okay.
Mohammed, can you elaborate in the chat, please? Or if anyone else can help out with TGE context.
But I can also, what do you prefer, Simon? Shall I respond quickly to the question, or did you want to wait and gather?
Yeah, please, you respond to that. And then as things come in,
while we warm up.
You can, yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for the questions. And of course, you're right. There are a lot more nuances that I hope that I can represent better in the length of the chapter than I could in the presentation, but that's of course my error. I think, yeah, it's widely debated to what extent Black activists in Tunisia constitute a movement beyond, say, a kind of a certain mobilization of a certain educated elite. However, I believe I'm right in saying that it goes a bit beyond just kind of elite capital-based movement. In fact, had a lot of particularly women activists from the south of the country got very involved in some of the work that I referred to, some of the activities that I referred to. I mean, it does coalesce, the mobilization does coalesce around 3 or 4 particular associations that are very dominant. And the individuals that lead those associations, of course, are very dominant in developing the discourse. And it's true that, as I alluded to when I was talking about the heterogeneity of any kind of sense of Black identity and culture in Tunisia, that there's lots of writing about how these activists really had to start developing a particular Black identity that they can mobilize around and kind of almost promote across the country. And there's some discussion and debate about whether or not particularly the Black communities in the South are as focused on the legal fight that's being pushed forward by some of the key associations in the mobilization, or whether or not they're more focused on what we might think of as being quotidian socioeconomic issues around access to jobs, for example, and well-paid work. And so there are quite a lot of differences and diversities within the activism. And I think, you're absolutely right to raise that, and thank you for doing so. And I hope my response goes some way to answering, or at least contributing to the discussion you want to raise. Thank you.
Thanks, Bryony. I have a question for Dima, if I may, and then we have a question from Stacey. Dima, in your presentation, you were talking about this crisis of the state and crisis of a collective citizenship. And in some of the surveys that CEPAD has done recently, which is very much in its infancy, we've got the results back, we're analyzing them right now, but it seemed to suggest that rather than the traditional assumption about doubling down on the sect, on the Zuama, on the the communal group to provide basic needs, that there was a rejection of that in favor of a broader collective, maybe a move towards interest-based politics rather than a move towards issue-based politics rather than identity-based politics, perhaps seen in the revolutions, the October revolutions. I wonder if you could maybe just elaborate on that within the context of what you were saying with the crisis of collective citizenship and the state and people then retreating back into those localized identities. It seems that there's some stuff going on here that we've not fully theorized yet, we've not fully understood moving between these different types of identity groups, if that makes sense. Sorry, long 2 days, and I don't know if that was particularly cogent or not. But I'll just read Stacey's question as well, and then we can have those two. So Stacey says, on some level, constitutions require technical expertise, brackets legal, political. And so it would seem you can't pull the elite completely out of it in the best circumstances. What would this group recommend to making these folks facilitators of the people's will rather than imposing themselves on the constitution? And so I guess that would be a question to everyone. So perhaps Dima, you can kick us off, and then we'll go in the order of the panel speakers, please.
Sure. I mean, and the part that I didn't get a chance to read through or to think about with you guys is this little bit of a contradiction as well in terms of, particularly following 2009 protests onwards, kind of a big, let's say, frustration, disillusionment, rejection of sectarianism and political elite, etc. But at the same time, that being said, I mean, given the multiple dimensions of the crisis that Lebanon is witnessing, this has also facilitated kind of like a return of the sectarian political parties in a way, and return to kind of survival mode, and everyone trenching back to their confessional groups and sects, with the crisis being so multidimensional. At the end of the day, what's happening nowadays is, food boxes coming at the end of the month, from political parties. None of the activist groups or the movements on the ground are able to compete in a way, or to maintain a space, a significant space in the public sphere, to compete with the political parties. Yes, on a personal level, many, including party supporters or affiliated with parties, many have rejected sectarianism and found a space in the 2019 revolution. But many of these same people, when it comes to everyday life, have had to return to the usual way of doing things, business as usual, in terms of political sectarianism. So unfortunately, the economic collapse has pushed us way far back in any progress that we might have achieved. At the same time, there's as well so we often speak about so needing a little bit of representatives from the civil society or the alternative movement in order to be able to negotiate or to push back, or even possibly be at the table when in the next phase, in an interim phase. But at the same time, that alternative movement is quite fragmented, as some of you might know, and increasingly so nowadays, and hardly any have a coherent program or that can speak to be a representative of a street nowadays. So I'm happy to talk a bit more, Simon, about this if you want later on, but I'll leave it for now.
Thanks, Dima. Yeah, we might want to come back to this. I think it's a really interesting point. Not just with regard to the Lebanese context, but also with regard to if we're moving into a post-Taif stage or a new type of constitutional arrangement that tries to reflect the Killan Yani Killan type of motif. How do you then build a constitution that that offers an alternative vision of political life beyond those types of communal identities? And I guess this relates back to Stacey's point.
Exactly.
So perhaps we can go in order of our speakers and just hear some general observations on that. So Nathan, please.
It's a great question, and the question is going to be much better than my answer, because it's not an easy thing to handle. I mean, I would distinguish between sort of legal and technical expertise on the one hand, and political expertise on the other. Legal and technical expertise, actually, to me, is not that big of an issue. When you get technical drafters in a room, what they tend to want to know is, okay, what is the political understanding that we are supposed to, put pen to paper to figure out, and then you want to use this word rather than that word, or this clause was used in that context that didn't work out that way. That actually isn't the issue so much. The issue, I think, has to do with the political actors and the way they see themselves. So when I was hearing Sinet talk about the Palestinian Constitution drafting effort and her references to leadership, I thought in one way it sounded very familiar to the portrait that I was talking about Egypt. You have a leadership that in a sense is doing what's necessary. They say, we need a constitution, we have authority from the PLO, we have authority this way, that way, and they are in a sense imposing a constitutional order without necessarily involving the society. That's not how they see their own role. Right. The leaders talk a very different language. In the Palestinian case, it's, we are the leaders of the Palestinian national movement. You have to understand, we've been leading this thing since the 1960s, where, when the Palestinian, they'll talk much more of the Palestinian revolution. And they have some kind of revolutionary legitimacy, popular legitimacy like that. My sense is that there are two things that we have to do, and they're both vague answers to Stacey. I think there are two things that have to be. Number one is start seeing constitutions not as abstract expressions of political will, but as political bargains among real political forces. And if you see them that way, then you realize sort of who has to be in the room. And the second is that those political leaders probably do have to be in the room. The leaders of key institutions usually have a veto power. And if they are included in a sense in a bargaining session rather than an imposition session, that is what has to be done. That is, I think, where some of the constitutional processes Certainly, I think where the Egyptian went off the rails, but I can think of some others as well. In a sense, it's sometimes connected with elements of the old regime, issues of transitional justice, and so on. So it's not an easy recommendation to either accept or implement. But that's how I would begin to think about it. See them as political actors among many who have to be brought to the table and have to be bargained with, but not allow their will to dictate to others.
Thanks, Nathan. That seems to be pointing to a particular answer to the question that I was posing to Dima just then as well. Then, Sanna.
I don't know what to add after Professor Brown, but I have to say, well, maybe I can just elaborate on something. So I think when it comes to the political elite and the constitution making, for them, constitution making, yes, it's the constitution is a bargain, political bargain, etc. And they will always be happy to do or to draft a constitution, because the constitution, you know, like sometimes it's a way to legitimize their authority. It's a way to facilitate certain things that they want. And it's a way also to show that there is a process happening. So the interesting part is not the constitution making, but the constitution building process, which actually could happen before and after the drafting. And I think sometimes the political elites, they are afraid of the constitution building process, because especially if the constitution building process occurs from grassroots or civil society, or even sometimes the academics, right? Sometimes if you start this kind of discussion, similar to the one we had, for example, in Palestine, the Constitution Awareness Campaign, right? It was not about drafting a constitution. It's about having the discussion about the constitution, why it's important, why it's needed. It's about the educational process. So it might end up we might end up having a constitution, we might not. But the constitution building process, where you commit yourself in this discussion, is where political elites are usually afraid to have. And sometimes, surprisingly, they are involved in it in order to prevent it from reaching, the level that like people want, or like interested people want it to reach, which is having this kind of like educational level among the people, which is usually minimum educational level, and sometimes it's even beyond the minimum. But once you give this kind of like information to the people, then their debate is not only, or their discussion is not, or does not come only from their political affiliation. Oh, we want a constitution because we want to remove this political leader. No, their discussions is about, their discussions to create a change. And I don't know if this answers Stacey's question, but this is just to add up on what Professor Brown was saying. And I don't know if this addition is something you agree on, but we always have this discussion about the constitution building the process, which for me is a major step. And for me, from being, like, let's say now in the drafting committee, I think this is what usually political elites are afraid of. There is something you were saying, Simon, to Dima also, about colon means colon and how to make people involved. I think this is one of the most interesting questions. It's about public participation, right? So it's not only about dragging the elites to make people involved. It's about how to make people more involved. So from the presentation, I've heard sometimes people lose hope, so they don't want to be involved in such things. And this is where Professor Brown was saying, if you look at the constitutions as abstracts, as not political bargains, then of course nobody wants to be involved, because for them there are a set of articles, set of rules, why to be involved. But if we consider them as something more, and this is where we were discussing the constitutional identity, if we think of them as the people's voice, then maybe we can have more involvement from the people. And I think this is a crucial part, like involving the elite will always happen, but involving the people is more a crucial part. I don't know, maybe I mixed things together or carried away. I will leave it to you, Simon.
Thanks, Senna. Well, I'm just going to pass it back over to Dima and then to Bryony.
All right, I'm not going to say much. I'm just going to echo with Nathan and Sana a little bit, that there's this, but also basing myself on the Lebanon case. Okay, as long as there's no radical overthrow of the system, and even if we are, and despite the fact that we might be, in complete rejection of the traditional power breakers, the traditional elite, etc., there is the expectation that they would be part of the process. It's hard to escape that. But the key over here is to widen as much as possible the spectrum of the voices that might be included in the constitution-making process. Sana said something really important that I second as well. It should be seen as well as kind of like an educational, informative, a big process, and that public consultation can take place pre-constitution writing, during the constitution writing, and afterwards at all stages. And it's been done here and there, and in some cases, Albania or South Africa, despite all the problems that we can identify as well. The key is to optimize a little bit. To optimize public consultations and public involvement, and to try to level out to an extent the playing field in this bargaining and this negotiation between the traditional elite who have the experience, the resources, etc., but also the public that is maybe new, but also potentially capable of engaging effectively in the bargaining process. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Dima. So there's an issue starting to emerge that I will pose. Stacey's had the same thought as me, but let's hear from Bryony first, please.
Thanks. I mean, I'm far less of an expert than the other members of the panel, but it's really interesting question, and my kind of political science training makes me always very wary of any term like will of the people. And as all the speakers have already said and illustrated, of course, this isn't a static thing, and the constitution should almost be seen as a kind of an ongoing dialogue, if possible, between different groups and positionalities in the society. And that's something that interests me a lot as a researcher who's very interested in contexts where the social contract has really broken down, horizontally and also vertically, through violence, for example. I mean, just to sort of respond maybe in a hopefully not too simplistic a way to the kind of the questions about should the elite be involved? Well, I mean, of course, because it's a dialogue, and as Dima was saying, it needs to be as inclusive as possible, and that they're important, of course. And the way in which I've been interested in constitutions and constitutional processes has been through looking at post-conflict societies and the kind of political communities and identities and activism that emerge at that time. And one of the other countries I've been working on, as I mentioned in my presentation, is Bosnia-Herzegovina, where the peace agreement essentially became the constitution, or the constitution was annexed to the peace agreement. And what happened there was you had almost a crystallization of the will of the people at that time, which was that they really wanted to fight each other, that they didn't want the others to have more power than their group had. And so the constitution became this kind of stymieing, it kind of has kind of really been a claustrophobic thing for the country's political and economic and social development ever since. It was in '95 that the peace agreement and constitution was developed. And you also had a lot of foreign experts, technical experts involved in this process, and they absolutely weren't independent. And so I think so much of the answer to the question just depends on, of course, on the context which we're talking about. But I think that, as the other panelists have said, principles around inclusivity and also emphasis on dialogue rather than closure is obviously incredibly important. And again, I'm not an expert on constitutions, but everything that the other panelists have said makes, really rings true for the way in which I've approached the subject as well.
Thanks, Bryony. So the issue seems to be, and this is something that I was thinking about, Stacey's put it in the Q&A and Ruba's put it in the chat, is how do you get around the issue of elite domination in these conversations? Elite domination either in terms of tyranny of the majority, a tyranny of the minority, or just an elite that has more economic, social, cultural, religious capital than another, or perhaps an elite that just accuses other groups of not upholding their end of the bargain, as Stacey talks about. She's referred to moves towards suspending the constitution. Ruba's put in the chat about the Iraqi political context has been held ransom, or the Iraqi constitutionalism is held ransom by the political elite. Maybe even more hopeless context in the eyes of many. But despite that, civil mobilization continues. So how do you get around that problem then of elite domination, or of particular elite domination and accusations of manipulation and holding hostage the other? I guess there's lots of nuanced issues here, but is there a way around it? Is there a way of rescuing the Iraqi constitutionalism from the ransom, or indeed other contexts? Nathan, are you going to be our negotiator or our hostage negotiator?
I'll think out loud here, which might be dangerous. These aren't easy. I mean, these aren't questions for which there are easy answers to. I would distinguish between two different kinds of situations. One might be more like the Lebanese and the Iraqi, where you have essentially a narrow group that kind of comes to an internal bargain and excludes others. And then you have a much more centralized order. And that, here are the Egyptian one, the Tunisian one prior to 2011. In the latter case, it's easier to say what you need and is more pluralism, more inclusivity, more publicity, and so on. What sort of the things that the others, and some of the others were, what they were talking about. Some kind of sense in which you have, I think, protracted processes with multiple actors, multiple ways of ensuring in public, not just formal public involvement, but public engagement, and some sort of acceptance of the idea that the political community is pluralistic in nature. So that's what you need, I think, in those situations, and that's, of course, easier said than done. The other kind of situations, the first that I talked about, is in a sense, these are societies that recognize that they're pluralistic, and so they designate, or certain people have designated themselves leaders for specific communities, and essentially evolve on power sharing. I think this, in a sense, when I was talking about the Palestinian context, this is a problem the Palestinians are facing with the division of the Palestinian people. Is there some kind of really kind of broadly based reconciliation, reconstitution of a Palestinian political community, or is there a deal between Hamas and Fatah where you get this, we get that? And my worry is, when people talk about reconciliation, the second path will lead them down in essence a dead end. So it's not easy to get out of that situation. It's very easy to come up with general principles and general ideas about inclusivity and pluralism, but finding some formula that can impose that on political leaders, I think, is very difficult.
Thanks, Nathan. Does anyone else want to come in on this?
Can I? Oh, sorry. No.
I think Dima's hand went up just before you said something, Sana.
Sorry, Sana. All right. I just wanna say that this was a really good question, something that I was thinking about earlier as well, and my response, my instinct is that I'm not too optimistic as to how we can do that. Again, I'm basing myself on the case of Lebanon, of course. So sectarianism was meant to be, or is said to be in the constitution as something that's interim. All right. Ta'if was supposed to be an interim arrangement, okay? But at the end of the day, we are still in a power sharing system, which inherently and by its nature relies on the cooperation on sectarian elites and their willingness to cooperate and their willingness to let go some of their, let's say, hold on power in order to open up and really face or open up to alternative voices. So I'm still struggling with this, but I see it as very much dependent on a political elite and a system that is made just like the Iraqi system or the Lebanese system. So I'd really be happy to hear more thoughts on that if anyone does have any, can push me on this.
Thanks, Dima. Sana, you wanted to say something as well?
No, I just, you said if you want to add something about the question, which I think is a great question, yeah, but I think there is this myth that constitutions will solve all the issues, right? And I think it's not, you know, usually, of course, well, mostly, in most cases, especially in the Arab world, constitution were part of the issue. And if we are looking at how to give a solution or how to make everybody included in this constitution, we might not have an answer. And I don't claim that I have the answer, but maybe the reason why I made this distinction between the constitution drafting and the constitution building process is because the building process can make sure at least that everybody will be involved, and it depends on their willingness to be involved. You know, there will always be people or groups that will be not excluded, they will be less favored in the constitution. And unfortunately, it's still the majority rule in most of the constitutional drafting. Even, you know, like, I think it's Bryony who said it's an ongoing dialogue. Unfortunately, it's not. At some point, constitutions should stop the dialogue and try to build stability. And this is the problem. On what stage we can say we reach the stability, especially in unstable political environments? Can we say, for example, in 2014 Tunisia, that we reach the stability and the 2014 constitution, you know, the dialogue stopped in 2014? Yes, they needed to stop it in 2014 to bring, you know, stability to the country. Unfortunately, we saw that stability is not there. And I have to say, I enjoyed very much your presentation, Bryony, because the anti-discrimination, the anti-racism, all these kinds of articles in the Tunisian constitution, for us, when we analyze them as constitutional lawyers, we never really think of the Black movement. So even in the scholarship writing about the constitution, this kind of group that they participated, they were not fully represented in the constitution. I don't know if it makes sense what I'm trying to say. Also, when we talk about, you know, the constitution building process and the ability to make everybody involved, or to make a change in order to make everybody involved, what if, you know, like, and if we say, oh, we want the people to have the final say, what if the people themselves, they don't want this to change? Does it mean that the constitution as it is, even if we disagree on it from the outside, it is still representative? For example, in the discussion that you have, Dima, you mentioned that you had interviews with youth, etc. But I wanted to say something. In my interview with talking about the constitutional identity in MENA region, one of the people I interviewed, and he's a very well-educated person, he said part of Lebanon's identity is its lack of identity, if that makes sense. And he loved it. And he said, like, if we're talking about drafting a new constitution, I'm very conscious and afraid that it will be, or it will have some kind of like religious implication. So if it's Muslim, then it will be Syria. And if it's fully Christian, then it would be Cyprus. So this vagueness about the constitutional identity in Lebanon, he loved it. And he said that this is what makes me Lebanese. So does it really mean that you know, if people are okay with this kind of sitting, even if it excludes others, then this is a good constitution? As Professor Brown said, or as Nathan said, there is no easy answer for this situation. Constitutions or drafting constitutions is one of the most hardest things, because if we want to consider it, as Brian said, an ongoing dialogue, then it's perfect. But again, when we were talking about the constitutional identity, we were saying that we should look at the people as they are and think of how they will be in the future. And this is extremely dangerous, because at some point you have to stop the drafting and say, voila, this is the constitution, this is what the society will be. And who's going to take this risk? Usually it's the political elites, right? Because the political elites say, this is what we imagine the society would be. And they usually do it if they don't have any opposition. And I think, for example, now I think Professor Brown can elaborate more on the Egyptian scenario. Now the Egyptian constitutional identity is changing, even though the Egyptians participated in the first place. Now, who's the one taking the decisions on a constitution that was originated from the people? It's the president, right? And I loved when you were talking about the voice, for example, the Bahraini constitution, and I love the fact that Stace is here. The Bahraini constitution, if we want to consider it now, it is a representation of the Bahraini, royal family. So even if we and even when they made this referendum or the national charter, I can't remember the exact name, they wanted to involve everybody, but the final say belonged to them. So there is no right way to say everybody will be included, but there is a way to say, let's go for a constitutional building process to make sure at least that people will be aware about what is happening. And I don't know, Professor, if you agree on that, Professor Brown.
Are you doing it on purpose?
I referred to you. No, I referred to him because Professor Brown is like the expert in all these kinds of constitutions. But I wanted to say what he really thinks about this.
Can I just, before you answer, Professor Brown, we are slightly on a clock. And there are a couple of questions for Bryony, but I don't want to deprive Sana of an answer. I just wanted to...
I can type my response as well in the Q&A, because I think it's easier.
Is that okay, Bryony?
Yeah, I don't want to stop the flow of the discussion, so I'll type my response.
Okay, well, fine. Thank you so much.
I may be depriving her of a good answer. So there's lots of professors here, so that's why I tease now about us using the title. But let me get to substantively. Sana has introduced something very interesting that I have to, I think, fully assimilate, and that is distinction between sort of constitution writing and constitution building. And I've heard her use the phrase before, so I should be more familiar with it. But I think that's a very useful starting point for understanding how to approach these questions, to approach them not as questions of drafting, how do you write this provision or that provision, or how is it, what are the rules for a referendum, and so on, but how it is that you construct a political environment that and as I said, over a protracted period in an inclusive manner, begins to bring in voices so that they can bargain in a way that doesn't simply reflect immediate pressures, but comes to an understanding about the ways to manage their differences. So that is a useful distinction, if I've understood it correctly. And if I were to give her a fuller answer, it would probably build on that distinction.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown. Given that we are now just about out of time, but I'm conscious that Bryony is trying desperately to get an answer in before we go. Sana, Dima, Bryony, would you like to add anything? Any final remarks on? Oh, good work, well done. On anything that's cropped up. I realize there's so much more to say on this, and it's been a fascinating way of ending these discussions. So thank you so much. But if anyone would like to offer a brief concluding remark, anything else left to say?
Can I thank them, if you don't mind, Simon? Because
if you must.
Yeah, I think I think because talking about constitutional identity as a vague concept, which I don't think it's, like after this discussion, it's extremely vague because, it's the way you want to make it fit into your, in the specific cases that we were talking about. So on your behalf, I would say, and CBAD team, I would really like to thank Nathan, Bryony, and Dima for this. And of course, you, Simon, for adding this constitutional panel to the conference. And yeah, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sana, as well. Add your name to that list. And it's been a really, really insightful panel. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for sticking with us to the very end, those of you who've managed it. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot. Thank you again, Elias, for all of your efforts. And yeah, please, everyone.